This video is a segment from my stream that I run every Sunday at 9 AM Eastern. I do anime analysis, Mushoku Tensei being the current focus, before capping things off with a video essay. Just remember that the link in the description is only to credit the original creator, without whom this video would not exist. It's not a license to be a dick. We don't do that here. If you get heated and just have to be mean, leave your comment on this video instead so that you can get it out of your system and I can get the algorithm boost. And if you got any suggestions for stuff you want me to cover, doesn't have to be Mushoku Tensei related, let me know and I'll consider it. With all that said, enjoy the video. Oh, and don't worry about the spoiler warning on screen, that was from a previous segment and I just forgot to remove it at the start. No plot spoilers for the anime onlys. Let's take a watch. I found this very interesting. I don't remember a whole lot of details because I was working while I listened to it, but let's take a look.
A common phrase I've heard when people have discussed and recommended Mushoku Tensei is that it is a slow burn show about redemption. I've agreed with this in the past. That's what this video was going to be about, but the further I looked into it, the more I disagreed with that assessment.
So the interesting thing about redemption in Mushoku Tensei is that it's not, I think it's a little bit overly simplistic, a bit reductionist to say it's a story about redemption, but redemption is a very important part of what Mushoku Tensei is about. Yeah, I mean, redemption is a factor in everything because there are a number of characters who, again, with Rudy being the quintessential example, who start out at their lowest point and then kind of have some realization that causes them to turn their lives around and go from degenerate to somebody who is respectable. So again, it's not that simple, but it's an interesting conversation. Yeah, and second chance is a big factor in the story. That's like a big part of it.
To see or not if Mushoku Tensei is about redemption, we first need to ask, what does Rudeus need to be redeemed of? Well, in his old life, we've learned of 3 main character traits. 1, he's a shut-in. 2, he's a lolicon. 3, he sacrificed his life saving another and attempting to save 2 more. The being who caused Rudeus to reincarnate may have taken pity on him and wanted him to try again.
Okay, so I will have to point out, he has, I think he has watched season 2 at this point, and he mentioned that he has not read past that point. So he is operating on some speculation, and it's one thing that we got to point out is that there was no being that chose him to reincarnate. He just kind of happened to be in the right place at the right time, and his soul just happened to be in the air when in that location. So I'm not going to be too critical of him for not knowing that, but that is the thing. And I will say that is also an interesting way of characterizing Rudy starting out with the idea of, yeah, he is a shut-in, he's a lolicon, and he is willing to sacrifice himself under certain circumstances. I would also highlight the fact that he is deeply traumatized. You know, he is literally dealing with sexual trauma. So I think that's a key factor in why Rudy is the way he is that sets the framework of the story moving forward. But I'm not I know I'm nitpicking a bit here. So let's just keep seeing where he goes with this.
Being this good side to him. The only thing we know about this is that the man god tells us the wicked dragon god deals with summoning. And we know the dragon god is Orsted. It's a bit strange that Orsted then tries to kill Rudeus when they meet, but I've not read ahead so I can't explain this.
Yeah, so again, I'm not going to be too harsh on him for not knowing what happens, but we know that Orsted was not directly involved in Rudy's reincarnation. Orsted's actions trying to kill Rudy make a whole lot of sense when you know his motivations. And, oh, actually, now that I think about it, I should take down the spoiler warning I had on that, because that is no longer necessary. Okay, so I have not seen the Mother's Basement videos on Mushoku Tensei, but knowing Mother's Basement, I do not hold a whole lot of hope for that. He tends to have some interesting takes, and that's all I will say on the matter.
And it's possible that the man god just lied about this piece of information in the first place. In terms of things that Rudeus needs to be redeemed of, it's the ill effects of being a shut-in. At the end of his old life, these effects were his inability to leave the house and one-sidedly relying on his parents, and his perverted nature, which at the best of times is seen as creepy.
do kind of agree with what he's saying here. But I think he's not giving it the full context it really needs. Because it's not that his issues are the result of him being a shut-in. It's more that he's a shut-in as the result of his issues and his inability to really rely on people to help him. Where he pushes people away because he internalizes his hurt. And that eventually leads to him developing a safe space in multiple senses of the word, where physically his safe space is his room, where all of his comforts are, and he's afraid of the outside world because the outside world hurts him. And that's kind of where his agoraphobia comes from. But also, he has like an emotional safe place where the only thing that makes him feel good is masturbation, where is sexual pleasure. So that's kind of that's why he becomes such a pervert, at least in the early parts of the story, where he filters everything through sex. He interprets positive emotions in a sexual way because that's just how he looks at things. And it's not until like much later on where he's able to kind of come to a healthy understanding of his sexuality, and where he's at the point where he understands that inappropriate sexual actions are not okay, but that sexuality is okay in the right circumstances. He has to come to that conclusion much later on. So again, I do agree with what this guy is saying, but not to the extent that he's saying it. I think he's leaving out a lot of important details that really frame the entire story of Rudy's character arc.
His negative traits aren't necessarily Rudeus' fault. We are given an origin for his trauma, and I think the story does a largely good job on balancing the negative with the reasons behind it. A bit like a sympathetic villain, where they do bad things, but we understand why. Think about those dying flashbacks in Demon Slayer as the demons are redeemed by Tanjiro. Or Doofenshmirtz and all the traumatic stuff he went through. To get anywhere with helping someone, you need to deal with the source, not the symptoms. The source of Rudeus' bad habits are from when he was bullied in school, making him hide away from the world. His parents, seemingly out of love, left him to his own devices, most likely hoping one day he would overcome his trauma. Rudeus' new parents took a much more active approach with their son. Once they learn he is proficient in magic, they immediately hire a magic tutor for him.
Okay, so I mean, it's interesting because again, I'm kind of have mixed feelings about this, where his parents in his old life weren't neglectful in a sense, but they weren't like, he did have a relatively privileged life in the real world too, where his parents tried to give him what they thought he needed. Like, they were willing to support him into his adulthood. They did all these things. And and then he, reincarnates into another privileged life where he has wealthy parents who can encourage him and set things up so that he can explore his talents. Again, I'm just not sure that the contrast he's highlighting there is something I can really agree with. And maybe I'll look at the Alan. Maybe I'll look at the Mother's Basement video at some point, because I haven't watched that one. I know I stopped watching his stuff years ago just because I got annoyed by him.
Paul starts teaching him the sword so he doesn't fall behind on this front. They make sure they are involved and personalise according to Rudeus' needs, as the initial plan was to just teach him to be a sword fighter. The training with Rock...
I don't quite agree with that. I don't think that they... I think Rudy's parents were, in his new life, are good parents. But I don't think they're as good as he's making them out to be. I think they both end up kind of stumbling a bit along the way, because let's not forget, both of them are in their early 20s at this point, and both of them have never had a kid before, so they're kind of fumbling their way through things. They're very loving parents, but I don't think they're as good parents as this guy's making them out to be.
He accumulated to a certain point, which I think is what got most people hooked on the show. No, not that bit, further on. Roxy takes Rudeus out of his home for his...
Okay, and I will say, this guy, one thing about this guy is his comedic timing is pretty good. He occasionally throws a couple of jokes in there. I remember finding them funny.
Final exam with her in a hugely powerful sequence as we see all of the trauma and fear bubble up inside of Rudeus, in which he then realizes it was all just in his head and that he remained safe outside of the confines of his home. Yep. It's almost a good enough sequence that it makes me not think about how little sense it makes that Rudeus spent 5 years without Zenith or Paul ever taking him out for a walk around the village. Oh my.
Okay, so I mean, somebody in his comments already addressed this issue. The idea that it's just, you don't usually take kids outside before 5 years old in the Mushoku Tensei's world. It's not something that's explained in the anime. It is in the books. So it's just a cultural thing where they protect kids during their most vulnerable years.
There's even a slight comparison to the bullies Rudeus had when he meets the children throwing the mud at Sylphie, who he easily deals with, which...
I wouldn't say there's a slight comparison. I would say this is like, the reason he confronts them to protect Sylphie is because this is something that is so key to his own trauma. This is something that's so important to him. He viewed these kids as the same type of people who bullied him. In fact, he views them as worse because he thinks he somewhat deserved the bullying that happened to him. But he's like, no, this person doesn't deserve that. So it's more than just slightly connected. It's intrinsic to Rudy's character and why they formed this bond so early. So I don't agree with him there.
Could show how much he has grown since that time nearly 30 years ago. It's not a very strong comparison, as I think it's more to serve as an introduction to Sylphie, and that I think if there is going to be a contrast to his Earth bullies, it will be at the Magical University of Renoa. Either way.
Not really. I mean, there were bullies there, but they weren't like, the bullying wasn't the key part. It was to set up the rivalry between him and the two Beast girls that he would then eventually, they would overcome that and become friends. But nah, there wasn't really a huge bullying angle going on there, at least not long term. So, and not in a way that I think paralleled Rudy's journey, but...
The source of Rudeus' growth here is love. If this show is about redemption, it is about redemption.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't talking about that person. I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm not going to try. I was talking about Lilina and Persena. They were bullies in their introduction, and then Rudy overcomes them, and then they end up coming to an agreement.
Kindness. The second character flaw Rudeus has is his perverted nature. Constantly.
Okay, that bonk was funny.
Throughout the series, he is caught leering, and the recipients of which are creeped out by this. The most common complaint about Rudeus' character is this trait, and the go-to response has been, this is a show about redemption. You're not meant to like everything about him from the get-go.
Okay, so, again, like, I don't disagree with that characterization of things, but I do think it's a little overly simplistic. It very reductionist, where, I mean, thing is, you're not supposed to like everything Rudy does at the start, because he is a total degenerate, and not in the fun way. Like, Rudy has these core issues that causes him to act as a bad person would. Even though he's not a bad person, he acts in the way a bad person would. And you're supposed to like Rudy, but not like the things he does. And I think the books do a better job at this particular angle because they really get into his head, so you can see the thought processes and how they come together to convince him that the bad things he does are okay. And it's not really until he starts learning that he starts to realize that what he's doing is not okay, and he slowly adjusts his behavior. But when you can see into his head, you can see that he can do bad things for non-malicious reasons. And you're supposed to be sympathetic to him, but not like the things that he does. So I will agree that, it is a case of you're not supposed to like what he's doing, but the way he's describing it is a bit reductionist.
Implies Rudeus will change from this nature by the end of the story. As a shut-in, Rudeus became a lolicon.
And he's right about that.
The first real
change.
showcase of this nature is when Rudeus is reincarnated and he meets Roxy. He says she's her type. But Your Honor, Roxy is a 40-year-old demon. My client remains innocent.
Although, yeah, I will say, and again, he's being funny about this, but one thing is they did soften up that introduction from the light novels. In the light novels, he explicitly mentions that one of the things he likes about her is that, at the time he thinks she's underage. So it's like underage, scornful eyes. And then there was another element to her that I'm not remembering, but that's what he was attracted to. Because he was attracted to her as the stereotype of the lolly magician.
He then meets Sylphie, who says he will mold her into his perfect woman.
That's that feels like a bit of a misrepresentation, because he mentions that one time and then he kind of immediately backtracks on that. Because I don't remember exactly how the anime does it, but in the book specifically, he mentions, he's like, I'll mold her into my perfect woman, Hikaru Genji style. Nope, bad thoughts. Like, he literally says bad thoughts. So, again, I feel like this is a bit of a misrepresentation, but I mean, another part of what he was going through at this point is that he was really struggling with his own desires, because, again, Sylphie was someone he was growing to care about. He was his first friend, and it was somebody who he's really starting to care about, who he wants to be by her side, and he can't really process what that set of emotions means to him. And then, so part of him is he's kind of struggling with, I want to treat her right, and I want to be with her. And part of him is saying, and even in the books, he knows that he's saying, I'm too young to be actually in a relationship with her. She's too young to be in a relationship with me. This is something that's going to happen 10 years down the line. But part of him is struggling with the idea of making her his perfect woman versus actually doing what's good for her. Yeah, and he was trying to be an oblivious protagonist because he viewed the world through his otaku lens. He still viewed this as following all the isekai tropes. It's just how he processes things at this point in time. And his conflicted emotions are kind of pushing him in both bad directions and good directions.
Pretty clear case. Luckily, his father catches on and separates the two. Rudeus himself agrees this is actually what is best for Sylphie, so she doesn't become dependent. Another win for my client. He then meets Eris. I can't defend this man anymore. 2 out of 3 isn't bad. I do want to put a quick trigger warning here. I presume everyone watching this video has...
I will say one thing is with Eris, he does act in a worse way in a vacuum. I will say, I think part of the reason he's as overt as he is and why the story isn't afraid to kind of go there with Eris is because she's like the only one who's able to really stand up to him in that capacity as a peer, where again, he'll cross lines that aren't lines for Eris, and she'll just hit him instead of actually getting genuinely hurt and upset. And when he does cross those lines with her, that's when he really gets affected, and that's when he changes.
Seen season 1 of Mushoku Tensei, so knows that Rudeus and Eris have sex. This happens while Eris is 15 and while Rudeus is 12 physically. He has the mental age and maturity of a 46-year-old.
Okay, I don't quite agree with this. He does have the mental age of a 48-year-old. I would not agree that he has the maturity of a 48-year-old. So it's an interesting thing about that is that with Rudy, I do believe his emotional growth was very much stunted by his trauma in his past life, and I don't think he really ever emotionally aged past the 14, 15-year-old self that he was. And I think in many ways he also regressed a lot. And it's not going to be a one-to-one. It's not like he just paused in his mental development. It's just that it didn't move in a way that ended with him being any more mature. And in my experience, his emotional maturity, at least, when he reincarnates, tends to be about in line with his physical age. He still has an adult's intellect, but I don't think his emotional growth is that of an adult. I think that when he's 10 years old, he has about the emotional development of a 10-year-old. So I don't quite agree with his representation of things here. And I will also say, just to respond to Rish, I completely disagree that Sylphie was in any way groomed, because even just looking at the timeline of things, remember, they met at 5 years old, they were friends for 2 years old, and then got separated for another, 7 years after that. And welcome, Phoenyck. Glad to see you. We're watching a video essay and talking about it, because I thought it was interesting.
Or a 34-year-old plus 12 years if you want to be pedantic. I'm going to discuss the mental state of both characters at this point in the story, and maybe you watch this scene just waiting for them to get past this and don't want to think too deeply about any.
Well, I will also say it's probably not super fair of him to discuss it, because he's kind of applying real world morality on onto Mushoku Tensei when, and again, you can have this debate, this moral debate, but when it comes to this sex scene, you gotta remember that 15 is the age of majority here. So yes, while it does sound very bad that he's, sleeping with a 15-year-old, in this world, that's like normal. That she's an adult by their standards. And again, you can have that moral debate, but acting like it's exactly the same as sleeping with a 15-year-old in this world, especially considering Eris had to be essentially forcibly grow up. Yeah, and again, and that's also true. What is the reality of the people going through it in this moment? Again, I can get why you would be uncomfortable with the idea of him sleeping with a 15-year-old, but it's not the same.
The implications this sets up, but since this video is effectively a character study on Rudeus, I will...
And that's also another key example, is that when it comes to the morality of Mushoku Tensei, Rudy, while he doesn't necessarily agree with all the moral principles of this world, he, for the most part, is kind of at a point where he just wants to exist within the world. He doesn't try to go for these systemic changes just because he tends to have bigger things to deal with.
We'll be looking in detail at Rudeus's actions and thoughts prior, during, and after this part in relation to his sexual desires, and I fully understand if that's not for you. If so, I have 2 timestamps. The first skips over the more unsavory details and comes back in for the possible repercussions Rudeus will face because of his sexual desires and how that will affect his redemption arc, and the other timestamp skips the thing entirely.
Yeah, I'm not a coward, I'm not skipping shit.
The instance of Eris and Rudeus's sexual relationship is Rudeus's 10th birthday, when Eris waits for Rudeus in his bedroom. At this point in the story, it is quite clear that there are no age of consent laws, as Eris's father Philip is very willing for the two to get together.
Okay, I will say that while I'm pretty sure that's true, there isn't like an actual age of consent in Mushoku Tensei. There's also the fact that in this context, he probably would have just ignored any that existed. So he's right, but I think there's a little bit more to it.
Context: in medieval history, age of consent laws, when first introduced in the 1200s, roughly coincided for when a girl reached puberty at about 12 years of age. Eris, during this scene, is 12 years old.
Okay, I think it's also applying a little bit too much real-world history to this, where I don't think Reframing was actually looking at the nuances of medieval European age of consent laws, because even when those were established, they kind of were ignored whenever it was convenient, especially with the nobility and the aristocracy.
Consent at this point was less about mental maturity and more measured solely on willingness, or willingness by the family, as a family could consent on behalf of a family member. I'm not going to blame the story for following these rules in terms of consent, as it does make sense given the setting of the world they inhabit. I have the same viewpoint about the setting, including slavery. Anyway, back to Rudeus.
I don't know, he says that, but he's kind of positioning things from the perspective of our real world morality. So I'm not entirely sure I agree with him when he says that.
Rudeus decides to provoke Eris into leaving his room by saying he may try something with her if she stays. Eris at this point is well aware of Rudeus's attraction to women, and Paul Greyrat's promiscuity is infamous.
Okay, it's more than just Paul's promiscuity. That's a Greyrat thing. All the Greyrats are horny in this story. So saying it's just, oh, he's Paul's son, Paul was just kind of took it to the nth degree. So I don't know. I think it goes a little bit deeper than he's saying there.
However, she has known Rudeus for some years now, and throughout the light novel, each chapter closes on how Eris is progressing, which includes a stat of her affections. At some point between...
Yeah, I will. This is a part of the books that I really liked. I thought this was a great way of introducing Eris's growth throughout this whole time.
Rudeus's 9th and 10th birthdays, Eris fell in love with him. Because she was in love with him, she doesn't deny his advances, which Rudeus then pursues, but pushes too far, so Eris does shut it down.
Okay, so I think he's not really exploring the full depth of what that scene meant. Because when Rudy tried to scare her away, basically, by saying he might do dirty things to her. That was him trying to use that as like a defensive mechanism to say like, hey, I don't want to be hurting this person, so I'm going to try to explain that things are too extreme for her so that I'm not put in this position. And he had no idea how to handle it when he was in this position that he was trying to avoid. And that's another thing. Yeah, he doesn't understand boundaries. He just knows that doesn't want to be put in that position because he doesn't trust himself. And then Eris is more receptive than he thinks she would be. He doesn't know how to process that. So he's like, oh, do I have a green light? Oh, what's going on? And then he doesn't realize that he pushes too far, ends up hurting her. And that's when he ends up, for the most part, keeping his hands to himself after that.
Rudeus does berate himself, realising that Eris just went to his room to comfort him as she wasn't able to get his parents to come to his birthday party, and fell for Rudeus's earlier act of vulnerability, which he did to show he appreciated the birthday surprise. Eris purely went to Rudeus to act as emotional support, and as such allowed a level of physical intimacy she wasn't used to provide this.
I completely disagree with that. I don't think she was trying to be his emotional support at that moment. I don't think that moment of him playing up his sadness was the thing that got him to make Eris want to be with him. I think it was a case of she wanted to make that day special for him. This was her way of expressing gratitude towards this person who she's grown to care about. And Rudy just unintentionally takes advantage of that, where Eris is in a relatively vulnerable state herself, where she cares about Rudy and has been uncomfortable expressing that at all. Doesn't really know how to deal with it. And again, she views his 10th birthday as how she's going to do that. Again, by making it special for him. That's what she wants for Rudy. Yeah. That's also true. I think part of it is they were trying to sort of set Rudy up with Eris for the political reasons. And that seemed like something Eris would have found acceptable. So yeah, I think this guy is completely wrong about Eris's frame of mind in this scene.
When Rudeus apologizes, Eris communicates her boundary that she will be willing when Rudeus reaches 15 years of age, when people officially become adults on the Six-Face world. This doesn't go to plan. After being teleported to the other side of the world and spending 3 years to get back home to find her parents and grandfather have died, and under threat she may be married off, this time, Eris looks for emotional support from Rudeus in the form of physical intimacy. I'm going to switch gears for a second because I've noticed a bias I have. I've flip-flopped on this scene quite a bit. I've watched the show twice and both times I've thought this scene was badly done. Or at least...
That is very weird to me. Because, again, I read the books before I watched the anime. I thought the scene was done very well. So, like... I find it interesting that his first reaction and his second reaction was that the scene wasn't good.
It's done in a way which does not paint Rudeus in a good light. I've watched the scene independently as well to make this video, and actually I saw a lot more favourably that time. I think my issue goes into what is Rudeus' intent. When Rudeus realises Eris wants to sleep with him, he internally worries that if he does, he'd be taking advantage of her. Eris then manages to seduce him, so they have sex. I think the story wanted Rudeus to be absolved of guilt by showing he considered that she was in a bad place emotionally, and since that Eris was the one who initiated, he wasn't the one who forced himself onto her.
I don't think I agree with that either. The way I kind of viewed this scene is I think I viewed the 5-year promise as way more impactful and way more important than I think this guy is viewing it. Because we have to remember, Rudy's entire frame of mind is he does not understand how people work, and he has to kind of grow up through fucking up. He fucks up, he learns from it, he hates that he makes someone feel bad, and he moves on from there. And we have to remember, the 5-year promise came right after he ended up hurting Eris, where he was put in a position where he was concerned that he might do something bad, and then he did do something bad and hurt somebody he cares about. And the 5-year promise was kind of how he he grabbed onto that point to where he's like, this is what I need to do to hold on to this 5-year promise. That is when my desires are going to be acceptable. That is how I can avoid hurting her. And of course, as they go through the demon continent stuff, he only grows to care about her more and more and more. And then he is put into this position where it's only been 3 years. So he still has it in his mind that he needs to wait 2 more years or he's doing something bad to her, that he's hurting her. And the fact that she's coming on to him is just making him short circuit. So, like, I don't think it's a case of we're trying to make Rudy absolved of guilt. It's that Rudy is in a very difficult place emotionally because at this point he is madly in love with her. He does have his desires for her, but he just has trouble accepting that she actually wants him. And so I think it's meant to be more like she pushes him into it because, I don't know. And there's also parts of Eris's personality too, where she's finally starting to really accept her feelings for Rudy at that moment, and that's been a slow build up to that point. And Rudy he still felt like it was morally the right thing to not be with her because he viewed that 5-year promise as such a quintessential part of his morality at this point and how he can avoid hurting her. And then she keeps pushing him and pushing him during this scene. And his emotions are starting to override his logic where he's fighting himself for it. And then eventually she says the line, like, "Give me your kittens." And that's when his floodgates completely break and he loses all self-control. And, he's kind of been brute forced into this highly emotional state of mind. So that's why it hurts him so badly when he thinks he's been rejected after that. Because he finally opened himself up to somebody, and not without some prying to it. She basically, she forced his walls down. He opened himself up to her, and then he felt like he was abandoned. That was the key idea of that scene right there. So I think he's completely wrong about how he's characterizing it.
That's a big improvement from his 10th birthday, but what irks me about this scene so much is they spend so much time making Rudeus not the bad guy, but they forget to make him the good guy. The narrative ticks all the boxes of
that's a weird way
Rudeus
of
being
putting it.
cognizant that Eris is vulnerable, and to have him be the one pushed into it by her. But when I watched this, Rudeus questioning himself didn't feel like it came from a place of concern for what's best for Eris, but if it's okay for him to finally get his dick wet.
Oh, I don't agree with that at all. I think that, I don't think there's supposed to be like a good or bad guy in this scene. I think it's just meant to be that, there's a complex emotions going on across the board. And it's just kind of watching them all clash together. So, and I don't think his whole thing was, I was thinking about if it's okay to get his dick wet. It's, again, he's latched onto that 5-year promise so much that his entire perspective is, this is what I need to do to not hurt this person that I care about. And now he's kind of being forced up against that, where she, in her emotional state of mind, he views her as kind of vulnerable at this moment, but she's trying to get him to break that promise he made, which he believes he's doing for her benefit, and doesn't realize that even, without her emotional state, this is something that she genuinely wants from him. And also, I think just there's more going on with the fact that Rudy, sexuality is such a key part of his personality that's like, it's pervasive. It would be too much to go through it all right now, but I don't think it's a mistake that every sexual partner Rudy has, the woman initiates, the first time. That is something important. And so I think the fact that Eris initiated is a lot more significant than he's making it out to be.
Rudeus lived in the Boreas Grey Rat mansion for 3 years. He's finally confronted with the truth that his village has been destroyed. That's more than enough reason for him to want to look for comfort in Eris, the same way she did him. But the scene focuses its attention on Rudeus' adult self and finally getting to lose his virginity, and it makes me think that's all this was to him, or at least it was his primary objective.
Oh no, it's not the act of sex that this scene was all about. It was him fully opening up to another person, being at his most vulnerable. Because, you know, he is a pervert. Like, that was his character up to this point. But you got to remember, it's not just that he likes sexual pleasure. You know, the fact that he was a virgin meant he had never really been with somebody in that capacity. He's never opened up to somebody in that capacity. And Eris is somebody he genuinely loves at this point, and he's willing to bare his entire soul to her, to open up to her in his most vulnerable moment. So it's not the sex itself, it's the connection that comes along with the sex. Like, and it's one of the things is again, so I listened to this video while I was at work, and this guy is not stupid. Like, he is very well spoken, he's clearly very thoughtful, he's got a lot going on, and I'm just gonna really quickly share the link to the video again for those of you who may have missed it. But so it does kind of baffle me that he is having this this interpretation of this scene. Welcome, Jeremiah's. It's just, I think he missed the point so hard here that it's kind of surprising. Because I just think he is a lot smarter than that.
And not that the scene is one where two people who clearly love each other
No, I do not
seek
speak
comfort from one
Spanish.
another after finding out they have lost family members and the place they once called home. I think that would have been a better way to handle this scene, and reminding the audience that Rudeus views himself as an adult now in his 40s, detached from the world around him, rubs me the wrong way.
Oh, I'm not sure I agree with that either. I don't think I agree that Rudy really views himself as a 40-year-old. I think he views himself as kind of in between, where he feels like his old mistakes are clinging to him, but that he's trying to really forge a new path in this new world. So yeah, I don't really agree with him there. I don't really agree with him that he views himself as an adult sleeping with a 15-year-old. I think he views himself as a new person weighed down by his past. Yeah, I mean, that's true. I know he hasn't read past season 2 at this point, but at the same time, I feel like you can still come to the conclusions I'm coming to without the context of the wider story. Although I will fully admit that it's hard to completely separate myself from that mindset.
Like I've said, I have softened from this position. I don't think the intention was this, but the way it was handled left me with this subtext, when I think the scene could have just been handled differently and avoided this situation altogether.
Yeah, I completely
disagree. Of course, this could just mean that his redemption is incomplete. After Rudeus loses his virginity, Eris leaves him, which results in a depressive episode and erectile dysfunction. I can't wait for people to be like, oh. You're catching on Mushoku Tensei? What arc are you on? I'm currently on the Dragon God arc. Oh, I'm currently on the I'm currently on the erectile dysfunction arc.
Okay, so that kind of rubs me the wrong way. So here's the thing: is that when it comes to so the fact that he's laughing about the erectile dysfunction. So like on the one hand, I do understand that out of context, it's a funny thing to say. Is like, oh, this fantasy isekai has an ED arc. That is kind of funny. But at the same time, I feel like you can't really laugh at it if you understand just how significant this section of Rudy's journey is. Because if you remember, like again, I think that comes with the idea of how he kind of missed the emotional aspect of the story that was represented by the sex. Because again, it's not that Rudy just got his dick wet, it's what that sex meant to him emotionally. And again, the fact that he feels like he was abandoned in his most vulnerable moment, like he's never been hurt as badly as this before. The fact that he's dealing with this sexual trauma for like, yeah, he deals with this for like a couple years. And the only way he ever deals with it is the way he actually finally heals is he goes through a bunch of things where he has a couple of failed sexual encounters where, again, he ends up hurting people because of how bitter he feels about himself. And the way he ends up getting better is when he reunites with Sylphie. And of course, they use the aphrodisiac to fix the mechanical issues. And then, he sleeps with a loving partner who wakes up next to him, who doesn't leave him. He is able to be emotional and open himself up again, putting himself in that risky position, and then somebody doesn't leave him. That is what allows him to finally heal from this. It's like a physical representation of his emotional state. I feel like, again, out of context, it's funny to talk about the impotence arc. But in context, it rubs me the wrong way to just laugh about it because it's so important.
You could argue this is just a part of his redemption arc. Rudeus made a mistake here and was punished for it, so now has to start to actually face and overcome this issue.
I don't think he's being punished for a mistake here. He keeps viewing the sex as something bad that Rudy does. And again, I just don't think that's what this scene was going for. And a lot of times Rudy doesn't get explicitly punished for his actions, but he ends up being his own worst critic. He ends up punishing himself and we're talking about Sylphie here. A good example is with the bath scene from season 1 or volume 1, where he pulls down Sylphie's underwear and he feels really bad about it. He doesn't really get punished for that at all. It's, Sylphie is upset with him, but forgives him quickly enough. Then you realize that much later on when they're reunited in Renoa, Sylphie kind of tries to orchestrate a scenario where they're going to kind of reenact that bath scene because she thought it was just a funny memory from when she was a kid, where Rudy still felt very bad about that. So, he was he punished himself for that moment, more so than he really deserved, if you really think about it, because Sylphie had forgiven him within a month. And yeah, I completely agree with that, where again, the aphrodisiac is what kind of got him over that initial hurdle, and the love and emotional connection is what kept him there, essentially.
Makes a lot of sense, but I want to make a counter argument. I think for someone going through redemption, they first have to be wrong, and the one to judge if Rudeus is wrong or not isn't me, it's not you, it's the author. What?
I don't... Well, I don't think I disagree with the core point, but I think his example is not very good here. Because again, he seems to kind of really want to think that it's Rudy sleeping with Eris is kind of the thing he needs to be redeemed for in this moment, when I don't think so. I think it was just Rudy acts... I think it's less about redeeming a particular action and more about redeeming your entire state of existence. Because the way Rudy was at the start, you could point to a number of things, but there's no one thing he was wrong for. It was an amalgamation of everything he was. And I think his redemption, because again, calling it redemption is a bit reductive, but his redemption was more about becoming a better person in its entirety. And again, I think the fact that he had 3 love interests, each of whom teach him something else that he has to learn. Again, he's not just redeeming himself in one way. It's every aspect of himself that needs to improve. It's not just, he's a pervert. He needs to learn to respect people's boundaries and all this stuff. It's he needs to learn boundaries and stuff and all that stuff. He needs to learn how to take action when it's necessary and not hide away. He needs to learn to develop some respect for himself and understand that he can rely on the people around him. Again, it's not just this one thing. And yeah, I also kind of agree and disagree about talking about the author, because I think authorial intent can be very important to properly understanding what a story is going for. Because a lot of times authors will try to deliberately tell these specific types of themes and messages. But I do agree that also some people can lean on it a bit too heavily to say anything I don't like is the author's fault.
While Rudeus is living with repercussions after sleeping with Eris, the story is not enforcing any ideas that Rudeus is in the wrong. His depressive state begins once he realises Eris has left him, and Rudeus concludes it's because he wasn't good enough, both in and out of bed. We, the viewer, know this is not the case, and it's because Eris feels she is lagging behind Rudeus and that she'll keep relying on him if they continue to travel together. An allusion to Rudeus's and Sylphie's separation early in the series, but this
I mean, I think there is a similarity between their separations, but I don't think it's really a parallel the way he thinks it is. But also, I think he almost hit the idea that, Rudy feels like Eris left him because he's not good enough, or that in some way his feelings were not truly reciprocated. Whereas Eris left because she felt she's not good enough for him. So they're both kind of operating under these internal conceptions of one another where they both put the other on a pedestal, and it's ultimately a miscommunication that kind of causes this whole thing. And it's I don't know, Rudy and Sylphie's separation was different.
Time instigated by one of the parties involved. Unfortunately, her letter didn't convey this well enough to Rudeus. However, this is a misunderstanding, not a lesson for Rudeus to learn from. This is not.
I don't think it needs to be a lesson. That's the issue with this. Like, I think the fact that it's not a lesson for him to learn, the fact that his broken mindset, like, he ends up causing a problem for himself. He ends up hurting emotionally, and this is not the reaction to a problem that needs to be fixed. This is what the problem that needs to be fixed currently is all about. So again, I think he's just kind of hung up on the idea that the sex scene is supposed to be this indictment of Rudy, and that's something he needs to overcome, when I think that's just it was a core emotional component of Eris, of Rudy, and of their collective mindsets and dynamics up to this point. Okay, so I think it feels like his entire argument is kind of centered around that misconception.
Not Eris being.
But like, the thing is, as much as he is, I think, completely wrong in a lot of what he's saying in this video, I do actually really like the way he's exploring his ideas. He may not be hitting the mark, in my opinion, but I do like the way he's approaching it. I like the way he's thinking about things. I like the way he's doing his best to be as fair as possible. Because, again, just because I disagree with him doesn't mean I think this guy is not a decent person. And not a decent creator. Because, again, I think this video is actually very good. I just happen to disagree with a lot of what he says.
Morally right about something, and punishing Rudeus for him to gain some introspection on in respect to his actions and viewpoints. In every instance of Rudeus's leering and sexual interest, the characters around him dismiss it either due to his age or because he is Paul Guérat's son, who is well known for his promiscuity. I've read the first few volumes of the light novel, and the amount of times the other characters mention Paul's sex drive and how Rudeus inherited it makes me think the only reason they included that character trait in Paul is to excuse Rudeus's behaviour down the line. But
I don't agree with that. 'Cause, I think part of it is, the thing is, people do kind of give Rudy a pass for his creepiness because of his perceived age. And I think that's part of the issue, is that a lot of times we see Rudy tends to punish himself more than anybody punishes him. So when he does something that he feels is wrong, he really leans in on that. He really internalizes that. Everything he views negatively about himself goes like just exponentially greater than how the other people view him. So I think it's actually very important that Rudy is not. I think it's important that Rudy is his own worst critic. So I think it actually makes sense that people will give him a pass for things that he doesn't necessarily give himself a pass for long term. Because eventually he does, and I will say the anime doesn't do as good a job of this, but there are times when he starts to get uncomfortable with his own idea of how things are. And also, I don't agree that Paul, his horniness is meant to excuse Rudy's behavior. I think that's completely incorrect. I think part of it is that Paul had to go through a lot of the same. Again, I believe the whole Mushoku Tensei, so many characters are meant to be direct parallels to Rudy, where they start out in a degenerate way and then they kind of grow up into their own thing. And I think Paul's journey into fatherhood was a big example of that for him, where he started out as a complete degenerate, narcissistic asshole. He raped Lilia. He did whatever he wanted. He tried to use Zenith for sex till he eventually gets her pregnant. He completely falls for her, and he completely turns his life around because he doesn't want to be a shitty father like his own father was. So I think that's what Paul's existence is supposed to be, where he is a horny person, where he and that does get him into trouble. The idea is that he's struggling with some of the same types of things that Rudy struggles with. And he grew out of it in his own way. Not entirely, because of course he does cheat on Zenith with Lilia, and that causes its own world of problems. But because he had his own journey, it just happened a little bit before the story started. And yeah, and then there is there is an aspect of the metaphysical side of things where his soul happened to find the original Rudy's body, and it also just kind of worked out just because the original child would have been stillborn, and Rudy just kind of took over empty real estate basically. And of course, that was somebody who was being born at around the same time Rudy's soul was transferred. So there are a bunch of extra technical elements that go into his reincarnation, but there's also it's not entirely relevant to this video here.
We, the viewer, know it's not from Paul, but it's actually from his previous life. The other characters have decided that this is not a problem, and while they may not know Rudeus is actually much older than he seems, this general attitude is not going to challenge Rudeus enough for introspection to change his mindset.
Again, I don't think he needs to have people externally challenge him. I think the fact that he grows through internal suffering, the fact that, again, his biggest moments of growth early on in the series, where he learns the most basic lessons such as, hey, boundaries are important, keep my hands to myself, that level of thing. It's when he fucks up, he hurts somebody he cares about, he internalizes that and says, I need to adjust myself so that I don't hurt them the same way ever again. And that's one of the reasons he clings to his 5-year promise. Because his whole thing was, hey, I touched Eris and I went too far. I crossed a line that I didn't know existed and I hurt her. We're drawing that line at 5 years. That's what I'm going to hold on to. And again, it's not that Eris hitting him, that's not like what made him grow in that moment. It's the fact that he took it upon himself and it's like, this is really terrible. I feel terrible because I made someone else feel terrible. I never want that to happen again. So it's his own internal mechanisms that are making him this way. So, and I think that's so much more important. Like it doesn't matter that other people aren't correcting him because he's correcting himself.
A common saying in book writing is that authors are sadists. They must challenge and push against the protagonist so the hero can grow and experience a character arc. Some stories do this by putting obstacles in the way of the hero to overcome, and while these characters may judge and punish the main character, we the viewer know this is unjust and that the main character is actually correct and their viewpoints are not being challenged, and all we have to do is wait for the hero to dish out his just desserts to the antagonists.
Okay, and there's also, I mean, he's not incorrect when he says this, but at the same time, he's kind of framing things as, the hero is right and the villain is wrong, when I think Mushoku Tensei is a lot more nuanced than that, where Rudy is kind of an amalgamation of right and wrong, and a lot of his opponents are an amalgamation of right and wrong, with Orsted being a prime example of that, which, for those of you who were watching earlier in the stream when we were looking at the fan animation, you'll know what I'm talking about there. I'm once again not going to spoil that, but Rudy, I think the big issue with him is Rudy is not universally all good. He's not always right. And, the fact that he is wrong is something that he needs to reconcile with himself.
In scenarios like this, the main character and the writer are not actually at odds, as clearly they hold the same values and morals. This is not the basis of a redemption story.
Okay, I also don't quite agree. I think not having a character face consequences for a wrong action doesn't necessarily mean that the author is saying that's a good thing. It could just be they're writing a story where somebody does bad things and doesn't have to face any kind of punishment for it. That's just a thing that happens in the real world, and it's something that can happen in stories. You know, sometimes bad things happen and there is no karma to it.
Ignore what's on the screen, by the way, that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. A lot of good stories have the author craft their characters, put them in a set of circumstances, and then let them rip. In these scenarios, the author will only try to affect the story by acting as a type of god, by causing natural events and circumstances for their characters to react in. In Mushoku Tensei, these are the turning points. The teleportation incident was clearly caused by something which will be revealed later in the story, but at the time...
Okay, just little side note. It's not important to his core point. He is kind of right and kind of wrong. I'm not going to say what it is, but in the books, it is eventually revealed what caused the teleportation incident, but it literally doesn't matter to the core plot of the story. It's like just a thing that happens, and the cause is not even directly connected to the main plot. So he couldn't have known that. I'm not going to fault him for that.
Happened, it is treated like some kind of natural catastrophe, such as a tsunami or earthquake. Rudeus meeting Orsted in the mountains was happenstance. The author put the two groups together and let the characters do the rest, which led to the beatdown. You could even argue Orsted himself is the phenomenon, considering he is so overpowered. Everything else...
He's actually more right about that than he thinks. I can't explain in detail without spoilers, but he accidentally hit the nail on the head with that one.
In the story has been character driven. There has been a clear motivation for every other driving force in the story, which is why the story is slow but feels so well fleshed out. I also really like the idea that the turning points are the only real interjections the author has on the world, since they're also catastrophic in nature and all clearly signpost as every turning point is labelled turning point. I think it's a great way to build hype when you see it, when you know one's coming, and you know what effect they could have on Rudeus and the other characters. Probably one of my favourite parts of the story.
I don't disagree with him here. I think the effect of the turning point is very well done overall. I wouldn't say they're the only time the author has some sort of impact on things, but for his core point, I do kind of agree with him here. And again, it's moments like this is why I actually really do like this video. Again, as much as I spent most of this time disagreeing with it and arguing with his points, but it's moments like this that really were like, oh, this is actually like a really thoughtful observation, really interesting way of looking at things. I do like this video, and I was actually very surprised to see that this guy has under 2,000 subscribers, even though this video went kind of viral. Well, not super viral. It got about 200K views, which is a lot for a channel of that size, but I don't know. I feel like I got about that many subscribers off of my first big breakout video.
As authors effectively act like gods of the worlds they write, their moral system is usually the one imposed on the world. What is considered good or bad in the narrative is decided by the author. Is the world one where all good deeds are rewarded and bad deeds are punished somewhere down the line by some seemingly all-powerful karmic system? And then what is considered good or bad in the first place? Do the smart characters win? Do the strong characters dominate? What usually wins in the long run is what the author themselves believes in, or is part of the message they want to convey.
Okay, well that is true broadly. I don't think it's true for Mushoku Tensei. I think, especially when you consider the idea that I talked about where Rudy is not actually the protagonist of the wider world, he really is a side character in the grand scheme of things. Again, I don't think Rudy Fujin made this as a thing where the things he likes or the things he finds good are what succeed in the end. Because, yeah, that's true. Showing Kishiniko when mentioning smart characters, that's a good point. But, I mean, the thing is, you know, throughout the course of Mushoku Tensei, you know, people make their own fuck-ups. The bad guys have their successes. And it's not always a case of, you know, good wins over evil. necessarily. I think there are a lot of issues. Like, I think one thing is with Rudy and Sarah. I don't know how the anime handles it because I have not watched that part of the anime yet. But when Rudy is dealing with his impotence and, Sarah kind of doesn't fall for him really, but develops an interest in him, they kind of frame it as, things could have progressed from there. They could have developed something with the two of them. But of course, Rudy, he fucks up. He is still bitter about his own scenario, and then he feels self-conscious about the fact that he can't get it up. And he ends up rejecting her and hurting her very deeply. And, completely kills any chance at them developing anything emotionally or romantically past that point, even though they do make up and find peace with one another later on. Again, in that case, that was a bad thing that had permanent consequences, and Rudy lost a potential love because of it. So, I don't know. I thought that was an example of just something that, again, it's not always that Rifujine's desires end up winning out.
I think a good litmus test on if Mushoku Tensei is about redemption is to compare it to another show that is also about redemption, preferably an isekai. Oh, here's one I made earlier. After collecting...
Okay, I will say also, I'm not as knowledgeable about Re:Zero as I am about Mushoku Tensei, because I have not read the source material for Re:Zero, and I've only seen the first 2 seasons of the anime, so I'm probably not going to have a whole lot to say about this, but we'll see. I don't remember exactly what he says in this part of the video.
His first couple of W's in Lagunica, Subaru gets himself a bit of a god complex. He starts to see himself as the always perfectly correct hero, and the world is for him to climb to the top of with waifus in tow.
Okay, I will say one thing in particular is there's a big contrast between Subaru and Rudy. We gotta remember that Rudy's big issue is his self-esteem. He views himself as so much worse than his reality, where he whenever he does something impressive, he downplays it. If you in the first volume, one of the things he does is he's reading it in the magic textbook, and he mentions, "Wow, Saint Tier is this crazy thing. It would be really cool if I could get to Saint Tier someday. That's so that's so insane. That's something to aspire to." Then when he becomes Saint Tier, 2 years later, he views it as just another thing, as normal, because he has this low self-esteem. He always knocks himself down. Whereas Subaru, at least in the early parts of his story, the fact that his power is so strong, even though he can't really control it, he puffs himself up, he builds himself up, and he gets knocked down because of it. So they have conflicting issues there, conflicting motivations. And so I think trying to draw too much of a connection between them is tough, just because they have different things they need to learn. And let's also not forget, while both of them were hikikomori, they were also just dealing with different issues. Rudy's issue was one that kind of born from trauma, whereas Subaru's was just kind of a generalized just set of emotional issues continuously weighing him down, but until they became too much for him. So again, I think these are while these characters have some superficial similarities, they are fundamentally different at their core, and it's really hard to compare the two of them from that. And also, I like Re:Zero too. I'm not talking shit about Re:Zero. At least of what I've seen so far, I liked it, but I need to read the source material at some point. And I do agree Saint Tier does kind of become a bit of a laughingstock, but that's just because of Rudy's perspective of having to just casually interact with some of the strongest people in the world. That kind of fucks with the power scaling.
Sound familiar? Part of this is rooted in the belief that the suffering he goes through earns him this reward and lifestyle. When he goes to the capital, however, Subaru gets the mother of all reality checks. He takes a moral standpoint to defend his waifu against the evil government around him, an outburst which is completely unwelcome by Emilia, who tried to avoid the scenario leading up to it. This outburst led to an argument between the two, which resulted in Subaru becoming estranged by the Emilia faction. Subaru still thinks he was right after this point, and learning that Emilia died without him there to save her strengthens this belief. The more he tries to save her, however, the more Subaru realizes this is not the case. Everyone around him questions his intentions, that he no longer wishes to improve himself, that he is hiding his selfish desires behind a thin veneer of heroism, that he is acting out of rage from being wronged, not out of wanting to save a person.
So I will say, I don't necessarily disagree with what he's saying about ReZero here. It's been a while since I've watched it, so I'm not confident saying like 100% that I agree, but this seems like a pretty reasonable take on Subaru's character and how people are viewing him. But again, I still maintain that he has a fundamentally different lesson to learn as Rudy. Whereas Rudy, like in a sense, his suffering is something he views as deserved in a sense. Like he believes that he's worthless and that when he hurts, it's just the universe righting itself. With Subaru, it was more a case of he has this weird sense of righteousness that's a little skewed, but then the fact that he can kind of redo things when he fucks up, when if he dies, he can just try again, even though he does suffer from his death. He kind of gets this complex of, I gotta really fight for the right thing, and it'll be okay as long as I keep trying and don't give up. So that he ends up developing a sense of, hey, all this suffering, I'm entitled to something good as a result of this suffering. Which, again, I think is in direct contrast to Rudy's, I deserve this suffering.
Amelia. The only one truly on his side throughout this is Rem. Stand up for Rem, boys, she's a real one. And when
Yeah, I'm 100% with him there. Rem is best girl.
Subaru finally realizes he is in the wrong and breaks down in front of her about his own powerlessness, wanting to give up. She wishes him not to, because he's her hero. This isn't a blind trust like other romantic interests having a self-inserted, overpowered protagonist in other shows.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's... You're right, Viking. Like, it is a bit of a clickbaity title, sort of. Not entirely, because that is his core point, is that it's not a redemption story, but that is how he kind of engages with things. And again, you got to play the YouTube game with your titles. I'm not hating it. I will say Ferris is also pretty great.
Again, ignore the footage, completely unrelated. Rem has an expectation of Subaru, an expectation she wants him to meet no matter what. This is shown in Season 2 when Subaru is once again at his breaking point and an apparition of Rem appears to soothe him.
Yes, I actually completely agree with that. What she does for Subaru is very similar to what Roxy does for Rudy. Of course, the scenario is a little bit different, and of course, they're not operating Rudy and Roxy were not operating as peers. But yeah, they do have that same kind of thing of pushing the main character to be better, as opposed to just being supportive, which they are supportive, but, giving them a supportive push out of the nest. And I will say, Viking, that this in this video, what this guy did is at this point, it was just, I believe, he watched the first 2 seasons of Mushoku Tensei and read up to that point in the books. So he didn't read the entire source material, but he read part of it. So, and he's kind of operating based on what his thoughts were at this point. So I'm trying to give him some leeway, just because, again, I don't think you have to necessarily consume the source material to have an opinion about an adaptation, but yeah, there is context he is missing. But I also think he's just, as much, and I will say, I do actually like this video. I do think he has some interesting ideas to talk about. But yeah, he does get some things that I feel he misses certain points pretty substantially.
Subaru figures out this is not his Rem because she tells him it's okay to rest. His Rem would never tell him this. She would support him to get Subaru back to his feet so they can face the enemy again. The breakdown Subaru has in front of Rem in Season 1 is a moment of introspection, which once resolved allowed Subaru to move on and combat against the White Whale and Betelgeuse. Up until this point of this arc, Subaru is in the wrong. The characters around him aren't. At this point, Subaru is...
I mean, I don't know if I would say, again, it's been a while since I've watched ReZero, so I'm not, the details are very, very fuzzy for me. But I wouldn't say Subaru was entirely in the wrong about everything. But, that was just one lesson he needed to learn, where he no matter what hardships he's facing in front of him, he needs to pick himself up again and keep fighting. He can't give in to his weaknesses. But I mean, overall, I think a lot of his goals were very noble. And yeah, again, it was just this one element of his selfishness was wrong, but I don't think they did. Yeah, but I don't know. I don't think it's a perfect comparison, but I don't hate it.
Is morally a completely different entity to the author and is challenged in a meaningful way because of it and grows as a person. I mean the bad bitch I scored by growing and changing as a person. I said earlier that if Mushoku Tensei is about redemption, it's about redemption through kindness. ReZero is about redemption through cruelty. Funnily enough,
that's an interesting way of putting it. I mean, there is some truth to that. I think a lot of times when Rudy experiences his growth, a lot of it is through him willing to connect with another person and to kind of open up emotionally. And of course, we've seen sometimes, at the end of season 1, sometimes that really bites him and ends up hurting him because of that. Rudy learning to rely on the people around him and to, have people he loves, to protect them, to work for them, to sacrifice for them, but also to let them support him. Like, I think that's kind of how Rudy does most of his growth. It's not from being knocked down. It's from building himself up with the people he can rely on. Whereas, again, with Subaru, it is a lot of it is he has to get knocked down. Again, I just think the core difference between Rudy and Subaru is Subaru needs to get knocked down, Rudy needs to be built up.
The main complaint of ReZero is that Subaru is unlikable, and to that I look at this arc and respond, that's the point. Back to Mushoku Tensei. The main reason I don't think the other characters are going to challenge Rudeus' mentality on this front is because of the previous example. When Rudeus, Eris, and Ruijerd, I don't know how to say his name,
Yeah, Ruijerd, that's pretty close. He pronounces it pretty good.
Make it to the holy country of Milis, Rudeus reunites with Paul, but it doesn't go smoothly. Paul accuses Rudeus of not doing enough since the teleportation incident, that he was negligent in finding out information regarding the outcome of being teleported, as he made the assumption it was just himself, Eris, and Ghislaine that were transported, that he didn't bother to get in contact with his family in that entire time, as Rudeus did just want to focus on going on an adventure. Paul eventually cools down from this position after being talked to where he was told he expected too much from a child who was put in this situation. Because of this, Rudeus is let off scot-free. Hot take incoming. Paul was right.
Okay, so I think Paul was... I don't agree that Paul was necessarily right. I think he was just wrong for the wrong reasons. And that, like, Geese was right for the wrong reasons. Where he's saying, it's not that Rudy is... Oh, no, he's just a child. Children can't be expected to take on this responsibility. But it is true that Rudy was completely overwhelmed by his circumstances. And it was, again, because remember, while he had been able to leave the house for several years at that point, he was doing a lot of growth as a person. He was thrust into this unfamiliar situation, teleported across the world into one of the most dangerous places in the world. And he had to kind of fight his way back home. Like, I don't know. I think it's kind of understandable that his mindset was so laser focused on that and about protecting Eris that anything coming across to the side kind of lost its importance. Where he had his one goal and he was pushing forward on that. And I do think it was unfair of Paul to say, hey, you were put in a very difficult position. You should have done more. When, Paul was put in a less difficult position where he was able to kind of regain his feet and get into a position where he could get back to Fatoa and get things started, where he didn't have to go on this same kind of long journey. I mean, not to say he didn't go on a big journey, but it wasn't quite the same as Rudy's scenario. And of course, Paul's an experienced adventurer, Rudy was not. So, again, while Rudy could have done more, I don't think it's right to say he definitely is wrong for not doing more.
One of the first thoughts Rudeus has when talking with the man god is if he, Eris, and Ghislaine were the only casualties of the teleportation incident. He just never picks up this thought again.
Okay. Again, I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier, where Rudy, has his severe self-esteem issues, and he punishes himself for everything. Where he, Rudy hears a criticism of himself, even if I think it's not justified, he doesn't view that as unjustified. He views it as, oh, there is something I could have done. And he just internalizes it. That's why he feels really bad about what he does. And in some ways, as much as it's not a good thing he needs to learn at the moment, he does end up kind of taking it upon himself, where he uses that mindset to say, there's still more I can do. I can't just focus on myself. And that's, I think, is a big reason he gets up out of his spiral at the end of season 1 and says, I'm going to find Zenith. And yeah, Viking, you have a point there too, where his priorities were elsewhere, understandably. Although there is, to be perfectly fair, there are instances where he was under less immediate threat, where he could have thought of exterior things, but I do, at its core, I do agree with your point.
Could have finished that train of thought at any point, discussed it with Eris, and they could have just added a throwaway line about keeping an eye out for any more teleport victims, which they clearly didn't find, so were never able to confirm if there were any more casualties. When he finally discusses this with Eris.
And I will say, you do meet some people who had their lives kind of thrown out of whack from teleportation much later in the story. I don't know. It's a complicated question, and also, even besides that, Rudy has kind of always had another more pressing goal in front of him. Even if it was a case of not just finding survivors in general, it's finding specific survivors, because finding Zenith became a major part of what's going on.
Eris, after they go to Millis, she already says that she has considered the possibility, so why hadn't Rudeus? Oh, I know, it's because Eris is best girl. Fight me, Roxy stands.
Okay, well, again, I'm not gonna advocate for Roxy over Eris, but as I said earlier, I am a Sylphie supremacist, so I think but Eris is great too. I can understand where the Eris people are coming from.
The first time he considers sending a letter to his family is when they reach the holy city of Millis, a year and a half after the teleportation. He had multiple opportunities for both of these points.
Okay, I will say also, in this instance, again, we're just kind of talking about some of the weeds of the world building, as opposed to anything approaching the core point. I think we got to acknowledge that it would be very hard to get a message from the Demon Continent to Fatoa. And I think it's much more likely for him to be able to get one from Millis to Asura, because they are allied. But yeah, I mean, again, the fact that getting stuff to and from the Demon Continent, they're so separated, both by distance, by an ocean, but also the fact that there's that historic prejudice between the two of them. Yeah, I don't think it's fair to expect him to send a message from the Demon Continent, because it would be expensive and likely would not reach its destination.
Good village? Maybe not the first town, because they did make it a point that saving money was an issue. However, they still seem to have enough money to travel across the entire continent for when they abruptly had to leave, which makes me think they did have some time to send out a letter. Rudeus definitely had the opportunity over the days in the second town of the Demon Continent when spending time looking for a vessel. And it's not like sending out a letter would make a difference. It would go to the village where there would be no one to receive it, or never make it there in the first place. And Rudeus wouldn't be the one to blame anymore, as he did actually think about making contact and made the effort to do so.
Okay, but I also think that would kind of destroy what the emotional moment between him and Paul was trying to do. Because I think the fact that there is this one thing that Rudy didn't do, whether it was right or wrong to expect him to have done that, we got to remember that, Rudy beats himself up over not coming to that conclusion himself. He is upset at himself for not sending the letter. Well, maybe he could have sent a letter or tried to send a letter, even if it didn't make it, but wouldn't, like, why would you want to do that and strip away this moment of Rudy being so self-critical? I feel like that wouldn't have actually improved anything. I feel like it would have made things worse. And it may have been explained in the books that the mail was not reliable, but I also think that's just a logical conclusion to come to.
Yeah, I've now fixed both of Paul's arguments against Rudeus, so Rudeus is clearly in the right. Oh.
And also, he's also once again kind of harping on the idea of, the hero needs to be in the right, where, I don't think either of them were in the right in this scenario. I think both of them during this conflict, they both acted like assholes to one another. They both tried to frame things in a way that was convenient to them and ended up completely. I mean, I mentioned it when we were going over this episode on stream, is that they were both talking past each other, both pushing buttons they didn't know the others had, and that's what led to their confrontation kind of exploding. So yeah, exactly. They were both wrong, both apologized. That was, I think he's missing that. He's kind of stuck on the traditional notion of the hero being right at his core, or the hero or the protagonist being completely wrong at his core. Like, when Mushoku Tensei is just a little bit more nuanced than that. A lot of people have there's very few all good or all bad characters.
But he was near his breaking point, dealing with all the stress of a potentially dangerous superherd and protecting Eris. Well, he didn't seem anywhere near his breaking point after he dismissed Rudeus being dangerous on their first meeting and believed the rumours to be naysay.
Well, okay, so I will also mention that Geese was not necessarily being 100% truthful when talking to Paul. He was definitely advocating for Rudy, and he was being truthful in terms of what his emotional state was likely going to be. But the details were kind of ones he made up for Paul's sake, because Geese was being very transparently manipulative during that scene, because he was trying to get Paul to, shake off his own worldview and try to consider things from Rudy's perspective. And in doing so, he allowed Paul to think of, hey, maybe I should actually listen to my son, hear where his state of mind is, and see if we can figure something out. And so, it's not that when he's talking about, there's a super that could kill us at any moment. Yeah, we all know that Rudy didn't put any stock in the rumors. But he had his other various stresses going on at the same time. And yeah, it's true that Rudeus did almost fuck with Rudy a lot, but it was the circumstances were a little bit different. But again, I think it was Geese not necessarily giving an accurate recounting of what Rudy went through, but trying to make him just, again, see that his perspective could be different and make Paul open to the idea that, Rudy's point of view could be different than his.
You know who was near their breaking point? Paul. The 3.5 minute opening sequence following Paul's perspective gave me a much better showcase of a man reaching his breaking point than 8 episodes following Rudeus.
Okay, so, and I will also say that opening segment with Paul was absolutely brilliant. I'm with him on that. But I also don't think at this moment Rudy was pushed towards his breaking point. I think it's more accurate to say he had a lot on his plate. He was constantly being challenged. He had his own difficulties. And really, actually, his breaking point came when Eris leaves him. So, or there's other moments, like after the teleportation labyrinth. He's also kind of at his breaking point there. And turning point 4. But let's not go into details with that one just yet. But, I mean, because I think a big thing about Rudy is that during this time, he had a lot of growth. He really had to, much like Eris, he was pushed into this circumstance where he had to do a lot of growing up very quickly in order to survive, in order to function in his new environment. So I think, the fact that he was not necessarily pushed to the point of breaking like Paul was, he still had a lot of emotional weight that he had to carry. It's just that overall, it ended up being a positive experience for him because he had a positive outcome from it.
Maybe you could argue Rudy is getting closer to his breaking point and looks very different, but after seeing him at the start of Season 2, I disagree. And there are 3 distinct times he gets close to his breaking point in Season 1. Each time a person dies.
I wouldn't say that people dying is what pushes him to his breaking point. Now, Rudy's aversion to killing is an important thing that the anime has not gotten to yet. That's something that gets explored in much more depth, in part in the Sharon arc, but there's also some other stuff going on as well. But yeah, I don't agree that just because Rudy was visibly affected by this, by the deaths that he witnessed, I don't think that pushed him towards his breaking point. That's just something that really just messes with him. He really hates the idea of people dying, and that's just how he kind of processes things, and that sets up a future character moment. But yeah, I don't agree that it's pushing him to his breaking point in the same way that Paul's was.
First in the alley, when Ghislaine saves his life from the kidnappers, when Rudeus kills a demon, and when Rudeus fails to save a child because he thinks he has to wait for the...
I will say also, this moment I think is closer to pushing him to his breaking point, just because it's not just somebody died, it's that an innocent person died and it's my fault.
opportune moment, when at this point in the story he should be completely aware that people can die fucking quickly. Rudeus keeps this level of disconnect to everything in the world as he still views himself as a man from a different one. Death.
Okay, there's also another factor, is that a key part of Rudy's issues, especially with self-esteem, is one thing is that every time he does build himself up, like even a little bit, he gets immediately knocked down, whether rightfully or wrongfully. So like in this moment, you know, he was leading the party and they were doing pretty well. So he was trying to orchestrate these things to be perfect. And he's like, I'm going to optimize these rescues, do it perfectly. We're doing great. And then of course he tries to do that, immediately causes somebody to die. He gets knocked down. It just, throughout all sorts of times, it keeps happening. And, you know, even when he loses his virginity, he builds himself up. He's like, I've finally been able to feel the touch of a woman, immediately feels abandoned, gets knocked down. That's a consistent pattern. So, I don't know. I think he kind of missed that. Although, granted, there's a lot of elements of that happen after the point the anime gets, so he wouldn't necessarily know about that.
Is not a real concept to him until it's staring him in the face and he realises that was life, and if he did something differently, that person wouldn't have died. A lesson which takes him 3 times to learn. He absolutely treated going.
I don't agree with that. I don't think the other 2 deaths are contributing to that lesson at all. Because let's not forget, the first death was a villain, a kidnapper, somebody who was trying to kidnap Eris for presumably Darius. And, you know, Ghislaine kills him, and he's upset, but it was the right thing to do. The second time, it's with somebody who probably didn't deserve death at that moment, because all his punishment was stealing pets and kicking Rudy. But, you know, he's still not like a great guy. But he, again, it's not a case, but it's not teaching him the lesson that was the third one, where an innocent kid died, and it was Rudy's inaction that caused it, and not just his inaction, but his preventing of Ruijerd's action that caused this kid to die. And again, that was the case. He built himself up a little bit only to get knocked down. And that was the lesson he needed to learn, is that, you know, he can't be showing off and puffing himself up like that.
Across the demon continent as a game. So when Paul pointed out these flaws, I was all for Rudeus about to have his breakdown moment, to realise he's not...
I'll say, I don't agree that this guy's a grifter. One thing I mentioned, you may not have been here for the start of it, is, you know, he's a very small YouTuber. And I think the video actually, while I think he's wrong in a lot of ways, I do think he actually was being genuine. He was actually trying to be thoughtful, and he was doing his best to be fair. I just think he completely missed the mark in a lot of his core ideas of what Mushoku Tensei is. So again, for me, when I call somebody a grifter, that's a very loaded term to me. I don't like to use it unless I'm really sure that I think somebody is making shit up. I don't think that's the case here, and so I'm not comfortable calling him a grifter at all. I think he's being genuine here.
Not treating his second chance with enough responsibility, that he is not earning his redemption, and then the world around Rudeus backs down. The reasoning is sound. Paul was absolutely being too harsh on an 11-year-old, and it was a great bit of growth for his character. But Rudeus isn't an 11-year-old, and the story has made that very clear. He is an adult man who we are meant to view as such, and he himself views himself as such.
Again, I think there's more nuance to what he's saying here. It's not that Rudy views himself as the 40-something-year-old from his past life, or that he views himself as the child from this life. I think it's kind of a bit in the middle. A grifter is somebody who takes a position, an opinionated position, not out of a true belief in that position, but because they can make money off of that position. Essentially, if you look like I'm not going to give any examples, but a lot of political channels on YouTube from all political positions, they don't necessarily agree with the politics that they hold. They know they can garner an audience and they can reap financial rewards because of it. So that's what a grifter is. But yeah,
We
let's
are
get back to it.
constantly reminded of this. When Rudeus reconciles with Paul, his inner monologue isn't one of a child wanting his father to comfort him or someone he needs emotional support from.
Yeah, well, I also think that's in this instance, again, Rudy kind of views himself as in between, and one thing you learn that in a point way past where the anime has gotten to, Rudy's kind of identity is marked as the symbol of the Migard pendant that he had. That's kind of how he identifies himself, because he doesn't view himself as his old self. He doesn't view himself as his new self. And he kind of views himself as kind of an amalgamation of the two. So it's not as clear as what he's saying, but also I think it's reasonable to not know about that at this point where this guy has seen to. And I will say I don't know about the web novels because I haven't read the web novels. I've only read the light novels, but Rudy had some questions as to whether his new brain affected his thought process at all. It was a question he had several times that never really got an answer.
But it's of an adult older than Paul.
But I will say it's my theory is that the weird combination of his emotional regression, his emotional stunting, and his new experiences in his new life, I do view him as emotionally maturing roughly in line with his physical age. So while he does retain his adult intellect, certain adult proclivities, I do think his actual maturity is generally about what we see his physical age being.
Analysing his performance as a father. Rudeus has no close connection with his family in the same way an actual child would, or a connection with children his own age. The reason I keep harping on how Rudeus views himself is because there are two ways reincarnation stories can be done. Either someone is reincarnated and views themselves as their previous self, but their life has effectively continued on, or they view themselves fully as this new person, but have memories of their previous life.
That is broadly, I think it's a bit more of a spectrum than that, but that is broadly how reincarnation stories do go.
This subtle shift can change a lot. Rudeus is definitely in the prior category. He is not written as a child who just has memories of his past life. I
don't know. Again, I think it's that's why I'm saying it's a spectrum. I think it's a lot more nuanced than this guy is making it seem. Where again, it's not that he views himself as his old self or as his new self. He's kind of he's conflicted about it. He feels like he's kind of a mix of the two, where the current self is what he's trying to build, but his old self is what he feels like he's being continually dragged down by. So again, I think there's a lot more nuance to it than this guy is saying, but I think a lot of that nuance comes out in places after the point he's stopped watching. So because the anime just hasn't gotten to those points where he really explores that yet.
He still views himself as his previous incarnation. That's fine, but I think the story should take that into account on how to treat his actions and what standard to put them to.
Well, there's also the fact that we can't expect the people around him to behave in that framework, because, I mean, I think also it's, as I was saying earlier, a key idea is that not that Rudy gets punished for his actions, but that Rudy punishes himself, oftentimes excessively. And I think that's the crux of where his growth comes from. And the fact that he internalizes stuff so much that, again, like you're pointing out, Amir, that this can cause negative outcomes for him, where he can actually push himself too far and not take himself into consideration for things. And and again, so yeah, I think you can't really operate on that kind of framework when talking about Rudy's actions.
I admit it might be difficult because you can't use the majority of characters to force those standards in the majority of situations without them looking like assholes. But the writer is the one who put himself in this position, and the fact the whole scenario is resolved with Rudeus being the one seen as the morally correct one and not...
I also disagree with that. I don't think that when he's talking about the Paul situation, I don't think Rudy was viewed as the morally correct one. I think it was probably viewed as more correct than Paul was, but I think it pretty definitively showed that they were both in the wrong.
Paul infuriates me. The demon continent would have been a perfect place to force these higher standards onto Rudeus in a way that wouldn't make it seem unfair for treating a child like an adult. Characters around Rudeus should view him as a child, so don't hold him up to certain standards, but the world what the author controls shouldn't. The way this exchange between Rudeus and Paul was handled coloured my view on how the rest of the story will play out, that the characters will not evaluate and judge Rudeus to the standards he should be because they do not know his true self and continue.
Well, I will also say, I think a lot of where Rudy really kind of comes into himself, where he's really has these expectations put on him, is after turning point 4. Because at that point, he does have his family that is in the process of being made. He starts to get a broader purpose. He needs to start to take on certain risks and sacrifices in order to achieve a greater good and to protect the ones he loves. I think this idea he wants is going to happen later on in the story.
You making excuses such as he's a child, or that since he's pervy he's always going to make sexual advances. Also, Rudeus isn't pushed on certain aspects of his personality. I don't see a show like that being a...
I mean, I will also say, I think Rudy's sexuality is also a lot more important than this guy seems to make it, because again, this is the way I view things, is that Rudy takes things where he kind of interprets a lot of emotions, a lot of his positive emotions early on in a sexual way, because for about 20 years, he only ever felt happiness when he was getting sexual pleasure. So coming to grips with his sexuality is a key moment of how he needs to grow. Not just in the case of, I need to not act inappropriately in a sexual manner, because again, the fact that he lusts after like everyone, the fact that he crosses lines, he sexually harasses and gropes people, like this is a big problem for him. Not only does he need to learn that that's not an okay way to be, he also later on needs to kind of accept that, you know what, it's not that sexuality is bad, because then he realizes that sex is a way he can express love between himself and his wives, people he does care about, and he comes to a healthy understanding of his sexuality. So again, I think it's wrong to just kind of gloss over Rudy's perviness, even though I think the anime does play it off as comedy more than the books do. Or at least when the books do it, they come alongside the context of how sex just encompasses everything in Rudy's mind. Because that's, again, it's hard to overstate just how much sex shapes his entire perspective.
About redemption. So then, what is the show about? There is definitely a change happening in Rudeus, from being the fat NEET, leeching off his parents, to the capable, strong, good-looking Rudeus. I think this will be perfectly exemplified when Rudeus views himself as such at some point when he goes to the astral plane to talk to the man god. But this change is not an external set of values.
Okay, so I will say, Rudy, I mean, I know he's just kind of speculating here. Rudy never actually fully comes to accept himself. His self-image improves greatly over the course of the story, but he always internalizes his issues. Even without going into spoilers, even towards the end of his life, he still punishes himself for perceived wrongdoings. So again, while I think his growth is a little bit different than that, but that is a part of it. But he never actually really overcomes that in its entirety.
And what's right and wrong. It's all Rudeus' choice. At the beginning of the show, Rudeus vows not to waste this new lease of life he was gifted with, and will do everything in his power to live the most fulfilling life he can and learn from his mistakes. But there is a bias here. Rudeus is the one who chooses his mistakes. He sees living in a room for 20 years, not working towards any goals, a mistake, so decides to work his ass off to learn magic.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know what this guy's life experience is, but, Rudy, while he was kind of in the throes of his depression, he was also experiencing, like, severe executive dysfunction as a result of that, which is a very common symptom of depression. It's also a symptom of other stuff like, ADHD, hello, and autism, and all sorts of things can cause it to be difficult to function in the in the real world, where and that's one thing is Rudy, he knew that something was wrong. He knew that he does theoretically have the power to change it, but he finds himself incapable of drawing up the motivation to change that. And I mean, I completely understand where he's coming from with that, because, as I've mentioned in the past, I have like really, really bad ADHD. And one thing is, it makes it difficult for me to just do the daily things that I need to function. Like, I'm lucky that going to work has never been an issue for me. Otherwise, I'd be fucked. But, even things like, doing my dishes, cleaning up the apartment, things like that. Having executive dysfunction makes it difficult to summon the effort needed to actually do that, even though I know that I am fully physically capable of doing that. And in the end, the thing that ended up helping me was I needed meds to help remove some of those hurdles that are in front of me, to make it a lot easier for me to focus on what I need to do and to attack my issues. So so again, Rudy is dealing with the same thing, just turned up to 11. Of course, his stems from trauma and not ADHD, but it's the same kind of thing. And once Rudy is kind of forced into a new environment, it forces a mindset change. And then, of course, the fact that he realizes magic is a thing and that excites him, that is enough of a catalyst to get him to start taking action and kind of break out of his initial executive dysfunction. So that is, I think, I can't necessarily blame him for not knowing that, because I think it's really hard to understand executive dysfunction if you've never been through it. But I do think that's kind of the perspective he's missing a bit here. And yeah, and it's also true that Rudy not ever having any kind of meaningful companionship, whether sexual or even platonic ones, like he didn't really have anyone he could confide in. Again, I don't quite think it's as on par with Food and Shelter, but again, the fact that he was essentially isolated, not just physically, but emotionally, is a key component to why he was so damaged.
To learn as many languages as possible, he sees straining his parents for decades a mistake, so makes a concerted effort to be more amicable to Zenith and Paul.
I will say also, I don't. Early on, one of the things that was going through Rudy's mind was not just I want to do right where I did wrong. It's a case of I want to use my intellect to try to mold things to be in my favor. Because again, in the early parts of the story, he's still a severely damaged person who doesn't understand people. He doesn't even really view them as real in the early stages of the show or the books. So. And the reason he is good to his parents is not because he cared about them. It's not because he thought that was the right thing to do. It was because he figured, if I was better to my parents, I might not have been kicked out like I was. So he's still in a very hyper-logical way of thinking, where he's still reeling from his old traumas and his recent traumas. And that's kind of how he's trying to navigate through things. He eventually does grow to care for his family. He does start to do things just because they're the right thing to do. But that's not where he is at that point in the story. I will say, Viking, I don't find that unlikely. I do not know nearly enough to be able to feel comfortable even saying that sounds right. So I don't know, but yeah. Well, also, I will say also, to be fair, it is a social thing in this new world that you don't really go out until you're 5. Everybody keeps the kids at home until they're 5 years old, doesn't really let anyone see them, and that's when they're allowed to kind of start exploring the world. So there are actual reasons beyond just his emotional issues that Roxy needs to push him through. There's also societal stuff that would keep him inside regardless.
He does not see viewing women through a pornographic lens a problem, so I do not think this mindset will get fixed in the future. He is treating the six-faced world as a second chance, but he hasn't reached the point where he sees the people in it as people. Instead,
okay, so I mean, I will say that is a core issue that Rudy does have. I think it slowly starts to improve, and I think it's actually like his a lot of that particular mindset is long and truly gone by the time season 1 ends. So I think let's see. So he starts. I think it starts out with just a couple of individual people that he starts to grow attached to. That he starts to realize that, oh, things are not just surrounding me. These people are all their own people, and he has these little moments of realization here and there. And it's, I think, through developing a connection with Eris and Ruigerd through their journey in the Demon Continent, that's when he starts to realize that, people are really people. And again, by the time the party splits up, I think he's pretty much gotten over that particular hurdle. But he is right that that is a hurdle that Rudy has to face. That is an astute observation. He's correct about that moment. I just think he got over it when this guy clearly doesn't think. And also, he is wrong about Rudy not viewing people sexually in the future, because he does. I will say around. I'm trying to think, because again, that's another issue that just slowly improve over time. Where I think even as early as the Beast, the Doldaya arc, where he is, where Rudy is, what do you call it? When Rudy is helping the enslaved beast children, where they don't really explain it in the anime, but in the books, he gets aroused by the little girls clinging on him, and he gets really uncomfortable by the idea that he's aroused at that moment. He's like, this is not the time for this. This is not appropriate. I shouldn't find this arousing, and it makes him really uncomfortable because he's still kind of in that middle section where he's realizing that viewing people sexually is not really the right thing to do, but he hasn't quite broken out of that conditioning yet. So again, I think it's something that he does kind of fix overall. And then again, once he develops his families and he is able to come to a healthy understanding of his own sexuality, he's able to kind of orient himself that way. So he is wrong at that much.
Set of characters to immerse himself in the fantasy. Because this is a story all about Rudeus deciding to live his best life by his terms. All my previous arguments rooted in the idea of redemption disappear like dust. I'm not saying I'm expecting this show to be morally perfect. Mushoku Tensei is famously known as the progenitor of the isekai genre, good and bad.
I'm not quite sure that's accurate. I don't know the history of isekai, so I can't say for sure. But the way I kind of viewed it is that Rudy, it plays off a lot of the isekai tropes, where it, especially early on in the show, where it's kind of doing kind of double duty. On one hand, it's kind of a soft parody of isekai very early on. It moves past that. But also, a lot of times, it's Rudy's expectations of things, is kind of viewing things in this isekai video gamey way. And that's kind of how he just processes things early on. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm not too knowledgeable on isekai in general, so I couldn't really say. I've only seen a handful of stuff personally.
Trashy isekai have taken concept from Mushoku Tensei and made them worse, or blander. Mushoku Tensei's world is incredibly immersive as they take their time to follow Rudeus' life in this character-driven plot. Other isekai don't. The self-insert protagonists in other isekai are given everything he dreams of from the get-go. They are about people with little personality thrown into a new world which realizes how much of a special snowflake they really are, and that they are essentially the perfect being, can do no wrong. So every choice they make is the correct one for the world, and in turn earns them incredible power and a harem.
Okay, I mean, I will say he's not wrong about a lot of isekai doing that. Although I think it's just a core issue of a lot of isekai are designed kind of as a power fantasy for teenage boys, where that's kind of the target audience. Where I think Mushoku Tensei is meant for. I think it touches on a lot of ideas that are more appropriate for an adult than for a teenager. So that's kind of the way I view Mushoku Tensei. Because again, I think a lot of what Mushoku Tensei does, I wouldn't have appreciated as a teenager, and that's because it tackles these ideas but does it in a certain way, whereas as opposed to the pure fun factor of a lot of other trashy isekai.
Mushoku Tensei has the beginnings of this. The self-insert in this case is not a blank slate who the viewer can project onto.
Okay, and I will also say, I don't think he really is a self-insert. I mean, also, self-insert kind of implies blank slate, I would say. Not 100% of the time, but I don't know. What he's trying to say is that Rudy is like a real character with his own issues and stuff, but yeah.
But Rudeus is a reflection of us at our worst points, showing us that if we still have some good in us, all we need is that second go. We've all told ourselves at some.
Well, I will also say I don't think Rudy is meant to be like a directly relatable person. Maybe he would relate to some people in Japan, because I know the hikikomori lifestyle is like an actual like problem that's been growing over there. So it may be more relatable to a Japanese audience, but again, I don't think it's meant to be like we see ourselves in Rudy. It's more like Rudy has a specific set of circumstances that molded him in a certain way, and he's kind of having to navigate that.
Point. Oh, if only I could do this again, or if only I knew this at the time. That if we were given a second chance from the beginning, we could prove to everyone, to ourselves, that we would do things perfectly. We wouldn't grumble on having to study hard.
I mean, I will also say, I think the idea is not necessarily that you need to be given a second chance. And I think it's more like Rudy always had the power within him to become better. It's just this kind of pushed him to actually realize that, because a lot of his issues, especially shown in season 1 of the show, is that, you know, he thinks of his parents and his friends, how they tried to reach out to him and comfort him, and he pushed them away. He realized, you know what, that was a mistake. That just made my situation worse. I should not have done that. So that when he has people who care about him in this world, he opens up and lets them in, as opposed to necessarily just pushing them away. And yeah, like I don't see new Rudy as fundamentally different than excuse me for 1 second. Yeah, I don't view that as yeah, I just don't see like that's how the things I completely lost my train of thought, but yeah, I don't think that's how that really works for Rudy's, at least.
Work hard. If we could try from the beginning again, because we'd appreciate what a gift life is. That our mistakes weren't really our fault. That we could do things right if we got the chance to try again. That's what Rudeus represents. Mushoku Tensei is absolutely an escape, but it's one about fixing your mistakes, not one where people realize you have no mistakes.
Okay, so I mean, his closing thoughts right there, I do kind of agree with that, where he's talking about how, again, it's not about you having no mistakes, it's about you fixing the mistakes you made in the past. So, like, he does have a point there. I'm just not sure it really connects to his arguments up to that point. But, yeah. Overall, I mean, the reason I decided to watch this on stream is because, again, I was at work. I happened to... This had been in my recommendations a bunch, so I decided to finally just give it a listen while I was working, and I did. I remember I found it very interesting, because I don't dislike this guy. I found it very... Again, I found it thought-provoking at times, but I also disagreed with a lot of the core elements, and once again, I'm going to just quickly throw the link in chat, just so you guys can support the original creator, because that's always the thing you should be doing. You should be checking them out, supporting them. Anybody watching on the VOD, I will be putting it in the description below. If I forgot to do that, please yell at me in the comments, but I should be remembering to do that. But yeah, overall, I thought this was an interesting video. It gave us a lot to talk about, and I do appreciate that, even if I don't necessarily agree with everything the guy said. I think he missed a lot of core elements, but I thought that I did genuinely enjoy this video, even though I thought it was wrong. So that was cool.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more, no more, no more, no more. Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more. What you say? Hit the road.